Okay, it is 10 o'clock, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started here. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. This is the latest Duke media briefing on the COVID-19 pandemic and its effects on society. I'm Greg Phillips with Duke Communications, and I'm here to moderate. We've got three Duke scholars with us today to discuss how faith leaders are providing support to their communities under the prohibition of large gatherings and how they're planning for upcoming observances of Easter, Passover, and Ramadan. I'll introduce them in turn and get the discussion going, and then we'll open it up to questions. And as I mentioned a moment ago, we are recording this briefing, and we can make that recording available afterward upon request. Everyone except our speakers is currently on mute, and so I'd ask you all to stay muted until we get to questions, and then we'll open it up. So with us this morning, we have Reverend Bruce Puckett, who is Assistant Dean of Duke University Chapel, an ordained elder in the Church of the Nazarene, and also spent 2 years as interim pastor for the congregation at Duke Chapel. Good morning. We also have Rabbi Elana Friedman, who's the campus rabbi and Jewish chaplain for Jewish life at Duke. She was ordained at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. Good morning to you. And then Chaplain Joshua Salam is director of Duke Center for Muslim Life. He has served in the US Air Force and as a police officer and managed the Civil Rights Department for the Council on American Islamic Relations. Good morning to you too.
Good morning.
Thank you. Finally, Professor Greg Jones is Dean of Duke Divinity School and a theologian who studies the nature of forgiveness, the significance of Christian ministry, and pastoral leadership. Dean Jones, Professor Jones, we'll start with you. Some churches have still been holding in-person services with people getting sick as a result, and now we're seeing some governors mention that large gatherings for religious purposes should be declared essential. What can be done to convince faith leaders to find other ways of bringing their congregations together right now?
A great question. I think we need to reframe the way we think about the issue. If it's framed in political terms or in terms of what the government determines, it tends to play itself into First Amendment issues and power struggles and plays into the odd ways in which that gets framed and interpreted in American life. I think that we need to be framing these issues not just in terms even of a public health crisis, but in the context of what it means to care for those who are most vulnerable. And if we're focused on caring for those who are most vulnerable, we're going to be gleaning the best wisdom we can from the experts about this crisis. There's plenty of evidence that when there have been gatherings, they've produced significant increases in the outbreak and have affected people who are the greatest at risk. And so I think that faith communities ought to be focused on what does it mean to care for those who are the most vulnerable in our communities, and how then do we provide outreach, connection, and worship and spiritual formation in creative and new ways that are also attentive to that. The longer we get it focused on what are governors asking or what's First Amendment rights, we'll continue to miss the central issues that would be most fruitful for guidance during this time.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. And so as you mentioned, each faith community is having to grapple with this. So Rabbi Elana, sorry, I got your name wrong earlier. I said Elana Friedman. I'd like to move on to you. Obviously, Passover begins on April 8th, and gathering is essential to the Seder. So how are you advising people to approach Passover this year, and what are some of the challenges associated with that?
Thanks for the name correction. Appreciate it. In this extraordinary time, I'm encouraging people to make decisions with the understanding that pikuach nefesh takes precedence. Pikuach nefesh is a value in Judaism that saving a life is more important than any other Jewish law or custom. So we're required to safeguard health and care for one another, and therefore disregard laws if they conflict with preserving a life. So with that in mind, we have to adhere to recommendations from health experts and local governments and stay home and not gather with folks outside of our current households, and that includes for the Passover Seder. And this is incredibly difficult for many people. It's against the spirit of Passover. The spirit of Passover is to welcome family and friends around the table to celebrate, and it's one of the most celebrated holidays for American Jews. Each year on Passover at the Seder, we say to each other, let all who are hungry come and eat. And this year we have to adapt. At Duke in particular, we usually have about 20 Sedarim all over campus with 700 attendees. It's a huge part of our Jewish life here on this and it's so important for so many in our community. And it's one of my favorite parts of our Seder custom and our tradition here is because we open our doors to everyone on campus, both Jewish, not Jewish, and we get to spend time with each other and share each other's customs. This is a huge loss for our community and for our experience, and it's an emotional one for a lot of people, but it's a necessary one. So I'm encouraging folks and doing whatever I can to tell people that we have to amend our Seder this year. We should do our best to stay healthy and help us get out of this narrow place. So if that makes sense for people to use technology like Zoom during their Seder or FaceTime and have a virtual Seder, which is so against what the Seder is about, so be it. And this is also, in particular, it's very important for risk or people who feel isolated that they do figure out a way to connect with other people during the Passover Seder. So for example, here with Jewish Life at Duke, I'll be hosting a virtual Seder, which is delightfully called a Zeder this year because it will be over Zoom. I didn't make that up, but I'm going to use it because it's adorable. And then I'll just say the second big challenge that we have is that following the dietary laws for Passover, we refrain from eating leavened foods, and many will only eat foods that have a designation that it's kosher for Passover. Additionally, we are required to eat matzah. Unfortunately, there are limitations on product availability this year. And this is not the year to go grocery store to grocery store to grocery store to find the products that you need. I'm encouraging people to do their best and understand that this is not the year to be strict. This is the time to not have judgment and burden oneself. Instead, you need to do what you can to make Passover meaningful, but with the understanding that this year is the exception, it is not the norm.
Gotcha. Thank you very much for that. And of course, you mentioned the dietary element of Passover, and that's obviously a huge element of Ramadan, which brings me to you, Chaplain Salam. Ramadan begins April 23rd. I mean, what particular challenges does isolation bring to observing Ramadan, and how can Muslim leaders such as yourself and their communities best approach it?
Thank you for having me, and thank you for the question. It's a little bit funny because the first challenge is in the question. You said Ramadan begins April 23rd. So I was planning for it to begin April 24th. There's always a debate in the Muslim community on when Ramadan begins, when is the Ramadan end. So there's a challenge in it of itself of, are we following do you go out and look for the moon, or do you go by calculation of the lunar calendar? And then we have other issues that may arise. I think Elana said it very well, very eloquently, that, these are new times, new circumstances. There's foundational rules in the faith that will trump other rules, but it's hard the first time that happens. For instance, if a person has been used to fasting their entire life, every Ramadan they fast, they get up in the morning, they eat, they don't eat or drink anything until the sun sets, and that's their routine religiously. If they ever have a medical condition that mandates that they have to take medicine during the day, sometimes that is so hard for them. They feel like their fast is not going to be accepted because I had to drink water and take 3 pills, and they'll try to avoid it and do all that they can because it just doesn't feel right. And so it takes a while to get used to that no, the faith allows, they understand that you have to take care of yourself, you have to live, and therefore fasting, it can be flexible for that person. And so I think this is creating a whole new world of religious thought, religious opinions on what is ritual, what is community, what are we going to do, because this hasn't happened before. So now the scholars are kind of going back to the drawing board. And our Jummah, not only Ramadan, but our Friday prayer, congregational prayer, people are debating about that. Most mosques have canceled it. And some people are saying, well, the Zoom congregation doesn't really count. So you can come on Zoom, but don't consider that your Friday prayer. So we'll see where this all goes from here. But I think it's at least good that it's opening up new doors of conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And all of our answers so far have focused a lot on how we can recreate these experiences online. Reverend Puckett, that brings me to you. Duke Chapel's had quite a lot of success so far with its online services. with Easter approaching, how are you planning to balance, the whole social distancing with providing congregational support at such an important time?
Yeah. So since first getting the word about the planned pauses for our regular activities, we've been thinking about and praying for all the people who we love and serve at the chapel. We've been thinking about the students and about the faculty and staff of the university, the community members and the congregation that regularly worships at the chapel, as well as the people who join us and look to us kind of all over the world for our regular services. So from the very beginning, because Duke's leadership and administration was really strong and took kind of a leading edge on closing down things and asking us to change our practices, we've had to consider how to balance the practices of social distancing and support for our congregation from really early on. Even thinking about the kind of little Easters that we have every Sunday, the little remembrances of Christ being risen, we had to think about how would we change those. And even the week before we knew we were going to not have in-person services anymore, we had already started changing some of our practices of being with one another, just to say we care for the physical needs of each other. And this has not been ideal, surely, for people who live faith. That's very much practiced through physical interaction with one another, whether it's sharing the communion meal together, or whether it's greeting one another with the peace of Christ, or any of those things. But at the heart of our life together is a calling to love one another with a self-sacrificial love, which in this moment surely means being willing to do the hard work of being physically distant, but socially and spiritually connected with one another. So we've committed at the chapel to continuing to produce a live stream service that is live at 11 o'clock on Sunday each week, and so that we can speak to the needs and concerns that are facing us today and offer the kind of support that we think we can best offer, usually in person, but in this moment, at least, to be able to speak live to that. We have the great blessing of this huge archive of past services that we've been able to point people toward, for people who long to be part of a more regular kind of service for us, and yet that's still not being able to be there in person. We recognize, though, that there's a great power in spaces, and while we definitely believe and are counting on that God shows up, whether you're in your living room or your bedroom or wherever you're turning on your computer or other device that you're listening in on the service, we know that a space like the chapel reminds people of their deep connection with God and with God's people. And so for us, we've decided that instead of, having a service from my living room or something like that, that as long as we're able and can do it safely, we're having people come in, and we're using the technologies that are already built into the chapel's systems in order that we can more deeply have this worship service. But one thing, if you've been able to pay attention at all to our services, you've seen that we're using a different space. We're using the Memorial Chapel space, which is within the main chapel, but on the kind of left-hand side as you enter. And the reason we're doing that is just to indicate we recognize that this is not business as usual for us, and this is not life as usual, and for anyone. So we're in a different space for this season. And yet, as we look to Easter, one thing that we're changing is we're going to move back into a more familiar space, still in some different kinds of ways, but at least saying an invitation that the season is changing. The Christian church season is changing from the season of Lent to the season of Easter, and trying to practice that in some ways too.
Terrific. Thank you very much for that. So now we've heard from all of our speakers, so we'd like to open it up to questions from the floor. If you are muted, if you're using Zoom, you've probably figured out by now how to unmute yourself, but you can just touch the screen and then hit the microphone in the bottom left-hand corner. If you've called in by cell phone, you can unmute yourself by hitting *6. So if we have any questions, please let us know who you are and the outlet you're calling from, and who you'd like to ask a question. Okay, it's possible people are having trouble unmuting themselves, but while we kind of work through that, Reverend Puckett, I did have a question for you. What kind of participation have you been seeing in the online services? And I gather that Easter is, as big an event you guys as Christmas sometimes. So I'm wondering what you're kind of expecting there.
Yeah, so we definitely have seen a pretty dramatic increase in our participation online. And I mean, for example, we're having pretty regularly as many as 1,000 people watching on YouTube Live, and then another 1,000 people watching the recorded YouTube service, plus about 700 participating on Facebook Live. And so, you know, on a typical Sunday service, maybe during this season of the year, we might have 550 people. But these numbers are way increased. On a typical Easter Sunday, we'll have a service in the garden at 6 a.m. Or 6:30 a.m. on Easter Sunday for a sunrise service, and that service has anywhere between 1,000 and 1,200. And then we have a 9 o'clock and an 11 o'clock service that would typically have between 1,100 and 1,250 or so people at each of those. So we're used to having on Easter Sunday about 3,000 people join us across 3 services. A little more than that. So it'll be interesting to see what that looks like compared to the numbers of like on March 22nd, we had about 2,000 people participating live in the service. So it'll be interesting just to see if those numbers go up dramatically for Easter Sunday, where people are typically more faithful in their church attendance, or if it'll be somewhat similar to what it's been over the last several weeks.
Gotcha. Thank you very much. I'm wondering, Rabbi Friedman or Chaplain Salam, if you guys have any perspective on kind of what kind of online participation you might have seen in your areas.
I can go first. Sorry, brother. Yeah, we've mostly switched online as well. It was our first initial reaction to these virtual methods and social distancing, was that we switched most of our programs to be online as much as possible. We have changed them a little bit to not keep them completely the same, since there's a bit more room for interaction. So our Shabbat service is a good example of this. On a typical week, we usually have around 100 students, 75 to 100 students come to our center, the Friedman Center for Jewish Life on campus, and have Shabbat services and Shabbat dinner. And now we're meeting over Zoom from 5 to 6 o'clock each Friday as a chance for people to connect with each other with some Shabbat prayers, although not the full Shabbat service, and some prayers and for our healthcare workers, knowing that students are not just looking for the same old service, but they're looking for a time to connect with each other, and share with one another how they're doing, and share. Our custom is to share the good thing of the week each week at the end of our service. So that's been a big highlight. The other interesting part about this is that students are able to share not just how they're feeling, but also their families and their pets as part of our services. So on a Zoom Shabbat, I see our students' faces, but then I also see their parents, sometimes grandparents and siblings, and their dogs and cats are involved in our Shabbat service. And that's been such a beautiful treat in this dark time where fear and uncertainty is present, but we celebrate Shabbat with our full community all over the world and bring in some light and some joy into our lives each and every week as we head into Shabbat. And I'll note the other really important piece of this is that a lot of people have reflected, and students have reflected, that time is hard to measure these days. With staying at home, it's hard to know when the weekend starts and when the week begins. And Shabbat is our way of making sure that we take a break. And even though we're staying home, we have to treat the end of the week differently, and we have to spend time with each other and think about gratitude, and perhaps enter into a spiritual moment over the course of Shabbat. But we need to switch gears a little bit so that all of this time that we're staying at home and in the midst, we're not letting it all be one nothing. We need some sort of rhythm to it. We need sacred time to be marked.
Gotcha, absolutely. Chaplain Salam, have you got any perspective on this online question?
Yeah, I think the first question to myself was, why haven't I been doing this all along? You know, there was a lot more people, well, let's say there were more people who were able to gain access that had never come to a service before. It was easier. It's less intimidating. You're in the comfort of your own home. You can be on video or not. You can be seen or not. And so, a couple of the people had been at Duke for 3 years, never come to any religious service, and had come to the online system. And I was like, wow, okay, maybe this is something I should have thought about before. And similarly, our service, so people come in, we have normally somewhere between 50 and 70 people that come to our Friday prayer service. After the prayer service, which is only 30 minutes, we socialize afterwards. Everybody kind of talks and gathers while we're eating pizza. We have pizza every Friday. So online, it's very cool because we tried to recreate that through Zoom. So because of the breakout rooms, I think the first Friday we had 30 people. The next Friday we had 40 people that tuned in, and they're coming from Minnesota, California, New York. Like Rabbi Elana says, some people gave the code to their parents and said, "Can our parents tune in?" And then we broke out into different, breakout groups of 3 or 4, just so that people could talk. And they really, really enjoyed it. It still gave them a sense of community. And a lot of people were quarantined in their basement. As soon as they got home, their parents put them in their basement, and they had been there for 2 weeks. And so they felt like this was a breath of fresh air. And we also said, bring your own pizza. So it made it like a creative thing of, can you make a piece of bread with sauce and cheese and, just kind of do something fun and creative. So it's been definitely, I think, an exercise of my own creative, spiritual development, and also thinking about access that I hadn't thought about before.
Absolutely, thank you. I have plenty more questions, but I'd like to open it up again to everyone that's on the call. We are going to try to unmute everybody, so you don't have to kind of grapple with that. So do we have any questions? Please let us know who you are and the outlet you're calling from.
I have a question.
Oh, go ahead.
Hi, this is Yonat from Religion News Service. I had a question for Dean Jones. I saw you mention at the end, a lot of people are reading now about governors issuing stay-at-home orders in which they're exempting religious groups because they're considered essential services. And you were saying that you didn't think that we should focus on that. I wondered if you could just reiterate what you said.
Sure. Thanks, Yonat. I would say that once we get into questions, the reactions that I've seen both from some governors and from others is that it gets framed in terms of First Amendment rights. And so it's a way of politicizing the issues, and it falls into ways of positioning religious freedom, I think, in some problematic ways, rather than continuing to press on what really is crucial and essential, and that it gives a kind of permission for what I would consider to be pretty irresponsible behavior, because the clear guidance is, as soon as you get to larger gatherings of 50 or 100 people, the likelihood of outbreak is going to be much higher. And I think that that's going to run afoul of deeper wisdom in religious traditions about caring for the most vulnerable. And so what it invites is a way for religious leaders to set, particularly more evangelical leaders, to say, we're not going to let the government tell us what to do. So by golly, we're going to go out and show that we can do this. And the power of prayer is going to triumph over everything else. And I think that just puts a lot of vulnerable people at risk. And the power of some of these clergy is that people are going to trust them and lead them into irresponsible behaviors. And so I think that the way we ought to be framing this is not in the context of First Amendment or what does the state have the authority to do or not do in relation to religious services, rather to say, yes, religious experience and religious services matter a lot. And now in this time, we need to be really creative in the ways that all three of my colleagues on the panel have been talking about in terms of how people gather. It's been, there's been some extraordinary stories that I've seen of congregations that, Christian congregations that have started having 4 or 5 worship services during the day. And they've turned their religious service more into a small group gathering that can be more interactive because people are yearning for connections in significant ways. I've also talked to people who've been connecting to multiple services, both live and virtual, virtually live and asynchronous, to connect, because people are longing for connections. The ways we've seen virtual cell phone choirs musically, or the Italians leaning out of their balconies to sing together. There have been some spontaneous and really creative ways to still think about being connected spiritually. And I think the framing of the First Amendment and what government is or isn't allowed to mandate just distorts and short circuits the creative possibilities for worship.
Thank you.
Okay, terrific. Do we have other questions?
Hi, my name is Celeste Gracia. I'm calling from WUNC. I have a question for either Reverend Puckett or Chaplain Salam. And you guys kind of already touched on this. I was wondering, what do you say to people who are worried about, who are worried and are feeling that they're lacking in their faith because they're not able to physically go to services? How do you address those concerns?
Reverend Puckett, please.
Yeah, so, I think that there are different kind of philosophies or theologies and Christian traditions about the mandate of attendance in services and those sorts of things. And I think that for some Christian traditions, for someone to think that they're missing a service or not attending mass or something like that, it might even lead to a thought of like a mortal sin or some kind of deep sinful practice. And so I think that there have been, I've heard my colleagues in ministry have to share with their parishioners or with the people who attend their church about, like, actually know that in this season, that is not how you need to think about this. This is not a sinful act. And for Christians, I think that there is an opportunity for us to lean into a sense of and a reminder that God is with us wherever we are, and a theology of the Spirit that allows for us to think about the ways that the Spirit of God lives in each of us. And if that is the case, then that kind of connection to God as a whole, regardless of being able to attend a worship service or gather with others, is a deep reminder that life does not have to stop, and life with God does not have to stop. And I think that kind of theological framework and that deep understanding of life with God that happens wherever you are, and that is deeply embedded in the Christian faith, allows for me at least, to give pastoral counsel and encouragement to people who may otherwise be feeling like, but my faith is so much dependent on my presence in particular places. And so then encouraging people to find ways to let their faith be deepened and be present even when they're not able to be physically in particular places.
Thank you. Chaplain Salam, have you got something to add there?
Sure. I thought she wanted one or the other, so we put our best foot forward, but I can go as well. I think, so in the Muslim tradition, there's a strong emphasis on you having this direct relationship with God, right? So you cry out to God, you call on to God, your prayers go to God. But still, even with all of that, people need some type of religious scholar to give them permission to do something that's a little outside of the norm. I personally don't like that, but I do understand it, that, people are calling scholars, emailing scholars. Can I do this? Is it okay to do this? And of course it makes sense because the scholar knows a lot more about the faith than they do. But my argument is that this person knows more about their life than the scholar does. This person knows more about their emotional connection, how stable they are, how much it would hurt them or help them if they did this or didn't do that. And like Elana said earlier, one of the key things in Islam, there's like protect your life, protect your relationship with God, protect your family, protect your customs. So this is pretty high up there for you to have a positive relationship with God. And so I think scholars of text often need to stay in close communication with scholars of context, which I would try to be closer to that. I feel like I'm more familiar with context of the people than scriptural text. But it has to be a communication conversation, and it is a problem right now. I'm hoping, I've personally been doing my part to call the scholars that I know, saying, hey, look, this is what's going on here. People are hurting, people are suffering, people are losing their faith. Can't you guys say this or do that? But it is a challenge. It is a challenge, and I think, just like any organization, policies aren't written until something happens. You can't make a policy book that's going to have every single possible thing that may happen in the future. But when something happens and you do it right or you mess up, you write a policy. This is our policy on this. So I think faith and religion is kind of the same way. Corona has happened. Now a lot of religious leaders are saying, okay, what are we going to do the next time people are forced into isolation for a month, 2 months, 3 months? What does our faith say? What does it allow?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. We'll open it up again. If anybody has additional questions, now's a good time.
Hi, my name.
Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. Hi, my name's Danae King. I'm a reporter at the Columbus Dispatch in Ohio. And I'm just curious, kind of, it's kind of momentous for all of these different religious traditions that they won't have this big, celebration or event annually. So I'm curious, how are you all coping with, not being able to come together for things like Easter and Passover and Ramadan, and how do you then, after you've coped, kind of help your congregations cope with the fact that they won't be able to have this, this is kind of a historic time when people won't be coming together for these things, at least in person.
Rabbi Elana, I'd love to hear from you on that.
Sure. Thanks for that question. I think this is extraordinary times. This is a moment that is unlike any other. And this is a time where, yes, we should be gentle with ourselves as spiritual leaders and clergy. And much of our focus needs to be on tending to the flock, as they say, on making sure that our students and our congregants feel connected, even though we are physically distant. And I know for me personally, this means deepening my own spiritual practice, whether it be personal meditation or prayer time. This has been the most connected I have ever been to other clergy in the world. I feel that our social media is buzzing with conversations on how we can make sure that we're staying spiritually resilient in this crisis, but also making sure that we are standing up and being present for our congregants and our students and our people. There are groups of people that I know are being so deeply affected by this crisis, whether they're being laid off, their school years are being upended, their family is getting sick. And this is a time that I think that spirituality and spiritual communities are so important. We're one of the few areas that I think there's an increase in need as opposed to a decrease in need. Maybe it's spiritual leaders and Instacart, if I were to guess the two areas. And this is the time that and not to say that we've all been training for this moment, unfortunately, but this is where I think spiritual life is here for people, and that's so, so important.
Absolutely. Danae, did you feel like that answered your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
Is that if I chime in on that too?
Sure, absolutely. Please go ahead.
Yeah, so I want to point to two things for people within the Christian tradition. I think one is, and this, borrowing from the Hebrew scriptures for sure, the practice of lament is so important. And I think that for myself, acknowledging grief and acknowledging that that I have a lot of questions about why, and not just with being able to celebrate Easter together with other people or any of those sorts of things. But but all the many losses that we're all experiencing, and I think that deep practices, leaning into the deep faithful practices of lament, of crying out to God in searching and in wondering, and not necessarily just for answers. I mean, but for a recognition that God is there and with us. And sometimes God reveals things and sometimes not, but there's a deep tradition, that praying through the Psalms. I have so many friends who have kind of returned to regular practice of praying through the Psalms that over and over again invite us to name the broken places of our world and our life and offer them to God. And so lament being on the one hand, and then for thinking about the Easter tradition, I think that a lot of people are writing about what a great opportunity it is for Christians to remember that the very first Easter was not one of massive celebration or huge gatherings or any of those things, but to lean in on the scriptural text to understand and remember what that first Easter morning was like, and experience that maybe in a different kind of way than we're used to doing it. And remember some of the brokenheartedness and the mystery and the all the deep emotions that were happening for the women who were who went to see or to tend to Jesus's body, and then the other disciples, and all of those characters in the story, and thinking deeply about how our own emotions in this moment and in this time of disappointment and dread and fear and all those things connect so deeply with the realities of the story and the realities of what happened on that first Easter morning. And so I think that I would say lament and a deeper leaning into kind of the mystery and story of Easter are ways that people within the Christian tradition can do that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Dean Jones, I wanted to ask you about something that Rabbi Elana said, mentioned about feeling more connected to clergy. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, do you think that in times that are so difficult and awful like this, there is an opportunity for people to connect across denominations and across faiths as well?
Yes, I do think so. And I think part of that's because people are puzzled and improvising and asking questions and seeking advice from one another. I've been seeing that a lot on various social media and other arenas. The kinds of issues about consulting religious scholars or practitioners, but it's also been a kind of, I've tried this, it didn't work. What do you think about that? What are the permissible possibilities that can be opened up? As well as what I think Rabbi Elana was talking about, which is the need for spiritual connection and just for finding deeper resources in this time. I found a lot more people just reaching out to be connected in one way or another. I think that's part of the phenomenon that you see with the musical interest, is a way of people just wanting to join voices together and to feel connected in surprising ways. One of the things, just to add on to the point that Bruce was making just a moment ago, I think one of the big concerns I have is that the tendency, as we come out of this, at whatever point we're able to start gathering again, there's going to be a temptation to just go back to normal very quickly and to have an explosion of large gatherings that could be equally problematic. And so this time of lament, this time of experimentation, this time of finding other ways to connect may be really crucial practices for us to be able to make the kinds of transitions that are likely to be required of us, so that we don't see a recurrence of the outbreak this fall or at other times. And if we had been able to just move very quickly back to a celebration of Passover or Ramadan or Easter, it might have given us an illusion that what we're experiencing is a blizzard that will end, and we could just, as soon as the snow starts to melt, go back to normal very quickly. I think we're more likely in winter, where we've got to just brace ourselves, and these practices that we're engaged in, including the practices of lament and waiting and patience, and the kinds of new connections that all my colleagues on the panel have been talking about, may help us in the long term, because I think this is, to mix a metaphor now, this is a marathon, not a sprint. And we've got to have very different patterns and practices and ways of caring for ourselves and one another than if we thought this is just something that will be resolved by mid-May or the end of May.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And when you say people are confused and improvising, I feel very seen by that comment myself. Okay, so we've still got a little bit of time here, so I'd like to open it up again if there are any more questions from anyone on the call. Okay, I'm not hearing anybody speaking up, but I have a question, and I'll come back to you, Dean Jones, and then I'd like to hear from everybody else with a perspective on this. I know that as faith leaders, one of the most important things, regardless of your faith, is tending to the sick and visiting the sick. But of course, right now we have more people who are sick, people who are scared, but at the same time, tending in person to the sick makes you run the risk of becoming a super spreader. And so I'm wondering, as faith leaders, how do you balance that need to be there on an individual level for your congregants against, you know, the terrible risks that are involved in that?
Well, it's an important question. One of the things that I would say within the Christian tradition has been that if you look historically in the time of the plagues of the 2nd century or other times, these have often been times when people of faith actually showed heroic self-sacrifice, particularly healthcare providers. I think ingredient in the vocation of healthcare is a willingness to take risks that other people don't take. And that's been schooled through the centuries by the art of dying as a practice and an ongoing awareness of our mortality that leads to a willingness to be able to sacrifice for the sake of those who are sick and to care for those who are most vulnerable, that just preserving my life is not as important as caring for those others in need. And that's been really important to see in the late 1700s during the yellow fever pandemic. People in my own Methodist tradition, including African Americans who were suffering in other ways, like Absalom Jones or Richard Allen, engaged in really frontline work, like what our healthcare providers are doing now, to care for the sick and to care for others. And so that injunction that Rabbi Elana was talking about in the Jewish tradition about saving a life, for many traditions, the priority is to save someone else's life, not myself. And so that willingness to engage has been at the heart of the vocation of healthcare practitioners down through the centuries, not only healthcare practitioners, but I think especially those. And it's important for faith leaders to be willing to reach out and provide that kind of frontline support as well as our own care of the sick.
Gotcha, absolutely. So yeah, you guys are on the front lines in similar ways that medical professionals are. Rabbi Elana, I'm wondering if you've got any perspective you can offer on that.
Yes, for the Jewish perspective, visiting the sick, which is known as Bikkur Cholim, is obviously emphasized to a great degree. And that in balance with Pikuach Nefesh, preserving a life, is what we're looking at. And like Professor Jones pointed out, this is a time where preserving a life is most important. So whether there's a committee of Bikkur Cholim committees, and some synagogues exist, or communities are looking at ways of supporting their members who are getting sick, we have to adapt. So that might mean dropping off food and necessary items with contactless delivery. That might mean making more phone calls and not dealing with visiting each other face-to-face at this time. It also means that I've heard that food pantries are running low, and those are necessities for some communities, and how people who are suffering financially are not able to get the food or medication or supplies that they need. And this is the time to sort of step up our generosity of our hearts, where we can't physically visit people, but what can we do as a community to make sure that people who are sick, who are struggling, are being cared for. And then again, I want to emphasize this is also our time to support our healthcare workers in any way that we can. We may not be able to physically reach out and give them hugs and support them, but how can we give them the tools and resources that they need to do the best work possible, so that we who can't visit those people know that they're going to be cared for and supported during this uncertain time. To me, is a fundamental principle of what Judaism is asking for us, is to figure out any way that we can be as generous as possible and support those who are ailing.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. Reverend Puckett or Chaplain Salam, do either of you have any additional points you'd like to make on that?
Well, I'll let Reverend Puckett go last. We saved the best for last. I don't have much to add. I just want to say that it's tough for people of faith. I think one of our panelists said before, sometimes people feel like the power of prayer will trump everything. And while I believe that, I pray that God will lift, this virus from us and bring us back to a state of normalcy, as opposed to saying, I'm going to go out there and, make contact with as many sick people and just believe that I won't get infected and believe that I won't infect other people. So, we pray for all the people who have to be out on those front lines. And it is difficult for faith leaders to kind of hold back and feel like they're not living up to their full duty as a religious leader. And that, as we spoke about before, but we were speaking about from a community member perspective of, are their rituals being accepted? Now, this question I feel is more like geared towards religious leaders. Like, are you doing what you're supposed to do? Are you worried about your own life? Or are you worried about other people's lives? And it may be some internal turmoil or confusion within religious leaders. So I hope that, they find guidance and wisdom to find other ways, like Rabbi Elana was saying, other ways to visit the sick, other ways to care for the sick, FaceTime on the phones, sending in mail, things like that, and just to treat this this pandemic like it is super contagious, and that we don't want to hurt or harm anyone, and sometimes we can do it without knowing and unwilling.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. We've reached 45 minutes, so I'm going to open it up one more time, see if there are any final questions, and if not, then we'll wrap this thing up. So does anybody else on the call have anything they'd like to ask any of our panelists?
Hi, this is Celeste again. I have another question, but if somebody else has a question, I can hold it.
I'm not hearing any other questions, so Celeste, if you've got a last one you'd like to get in, please do go ahead. Thank
you. I have a question for, I'm sorry, I'm trying to find it, for Rabbi Friedman. You were talking about earlier how you've been telling your congregants to use Zoom and FaceTime to connect. And I was just wondering what kind of response you've been getting. Obviously it is tough for everyone, and I can understand there's feelings of sadness or frustration, but overall, have people been accepting of the situation?
Thanks for your question, Celeste. I think people have been. I think, thankfully the technology is ready for us to connect on this way. And I think that students that I serve in particular have been jumping in to this new normal and using technology as a way to connect. I do think, and I worry that there will be some sort of Zoom burnout or virtual burnout over the next few weeks. There was excitement that we're able to connect this way. And there's a little part of me, and I think all of us are a bit drained from how much time we're spending looking into a computer screen and seeing each other two-dimensionally. And there might be a limit to that. I pray that there isn't, because if this is, as Professor Jones mentioned, a long-term situation that we're entering in, we need to sustain ourselves through this two-dimensional connection, because I think that interacting with each other and connecting with each other and our spiritual communities is so important at this time. So I think people have been responding really well to it. And there's some excitement to being able to, join a Shabbat service in your pajamas and have your pets with you. There's some time efficiency that people have noted has been helpful with this. Like others have mentioned, there's an ability to join multiple different services from different congregations. You can be on your home city's synagogue service, you can be in your college campus service, and then you can go visit your camp later that afternoon and see the people from those communities. So this is really allowing people to reach out in ways that they haven't before and still feel really connected, which I think is so essential during this time of uncertainty.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Rabbi Elana, and I think that's a perfect note on which to end. So thank you, everybody who has joined us on the call. The recording will be available just a few minutes afterwards. You can email Steve Hartsoe, whose email is on the release, and he can get that to you. As I mentioned, this is part of a regular series of briefings we're having here with Duke scholars on different aspects of the pandemic. We will have one next Wednesday at 10 a.m. on the effects of isolation. So thanks, everybody, for joining us. Thank you especially to our panelists, Dean Jones, Reverend Puckett, Rabbi Elana Friedman, and Chaplain Joshua Salam. Thank you all so much. Have a great day, and please stay well.
Thank you. You too.